As we begin our study of the profession of social work, our author Morley Glicken introduces us to some basic concepts about social work and about the kinds of things that we are going to find ourselves doing in this field. Just by way of some of my own thoughts about this and some thoughts that have come to me from other textbooks that I've read over the years about social work. Social work really can be considered to be the professional application of a lot of do-gooding kinds of behaviors or whatever in the history of the United States that have occurred. Really, our roots in social work is in volunteer efforts, but the difference here with professional social work is that instead of the notion that anybody can do this and that anybody with a heart can be effective in helping other people or helping people change, the concept of the social work profession is that this is a distinct field, it's a distinct profession, and something that one has to be trained in order to be able to be effective at. The application of professional services in social work includes social work values, social work principles, and specific techniques that you learn. And in the process of this, we begin to practice in a lot of different fields that include things like, well, for one, helping people obtain tangible services that they need in order to make their lives better. Another area that we might find ourselves working is the provision of treatment or counseling services with individuals, families, or groups. Sometimes social workers find themselves in community organization efforts and working with groups in order to provide social services to a larger population of people that are in need. And also, social workers find themselves working on a what we call a macro level of practice, where there's a lot of interventions in changing the institutions of society, advocating with the legislative process, and those kinds of things. And so, think about social work in terms of micro practice and macro practice. And perhaps, those two fields. So that the micro practice really is what a lot of us think of as in terms of clinical practice, but it's not just providing therapy and working with an individual, because micro practice involves working with the individual, family, and groups at different times. So this is sort of direct social work, direct services to an individual. Whereas macro practice, the professional finds himself or herself working with a community or their larger system. So the ameliorative effects of macro practice, that is, how it resolves and helps people, is much more indirect, in that instead of working to change an individual or to change a relationship that individual has, the professional is working to change the system, the larger system or the community, in such a way that life is better for those individuals that need that change. So, before we go into this too deeply, I'm going to tell you just one more time, get to know your Blackboard course if you haven't done this yet. If you skipped over the last lecture but you find yourself listening to this one, if you haven't read your syllabus, whatever, remember, make use of that Start Here item on your course menu. It's very important that you go through it, even if you've taken other Blackboard courses, whether it's from me or from other people. I have heard that my course is structured very differently from other instructors' courses online, and the way I expect things to be done is different from other instructors. And I'm sure that's true for just about every class. There isn't a uniform kind of approach to how online courses are structured. And so it's important that you review that Start Here item and do all the orientation activities that I ask you to do, so that you really understand what you're doing and what you have to do in this class. Explore all the buttons in the course menu. There will be new buttons, new items in the course menu come up as the semester goes along, but right now they're not there because you don't need them. But later on you'll see some new buttons popping up, and I'll let you know when they do. Be sure to print out your course syllabus and review it carefully. Let me know if there's any questions about that. And when you click on that weekly course content button each week, remember, new material opens every Sunday. Be sure you work through every course slide and work through them sequentially each week. Don't skip through the slides. Don't skip over things until you've gone through each of them one by one. And if you ever have any questions, please contact me by email or other means if you need to, but email is probably the most effective, and I'll be happy to try to respond as quickly as possible. This is my part-time job, remember, so I'm not sitting in an office waiting for a student to call me. Not that college professors do that anyway, but it will have to get my attention in the evening, and some evenings, frankly, I don't get to my email. Almost always I do. Now back to the topic and back to some of the things that Glicken talks about. Glicken starts out with exploring just what is a social problem to begin with. And a social problem, he says, is an issue within society that makes it difficult for people to achieve their full potential. One of those themes that's going to run through this course is looking at the inequalities in our society and the barriers that are erected by those in control in our society, the majority, that prevent those in need, particularly those in minority groups, from being able to reach their full potential. While our American values, one of those values says is that we all have an equal opportunity in a society. If you believe that, you really need to kind of work on dispelling that notion, because it simply isn't true. On the surface, it may appear that everybody has an equal chance and that anybody that works hard enough and tries hard enough can get on their feet and climb that ladder and become president or the head of the corporation or independently wealthy. But the fact is that this is true for only a very limited number of individuals, and there are lots of things in the way of everyone achieving the same kind of success that those individuals do. Individuals that face these problems have to experience such issues as poverty and housing problems, unemployment, discrimination in different settings such as housing or in employment practices, poverty, and so on. And so social problems such as these listed here on the screen and others are the kinds of things that really we address in the profession of social work. These problems affect many people directly and also very indirectly. So, for instance, children being abused today in my own office, we address issues about child abuse and neglect, and if a child isn't safe, if it's necessary to do this, the social worker that is investigating the family will remove that child and place the child in a safe setting. Or, if it's possible, we'll maintain the child in that home and work with the family to ameliorate the problems, the issues that are leading up to the maltreatment of children. That's the immediate problem, and the workers address that issue through their behaviors during the course of their investigation and family assessment. However, on a larger picture, children who are abused also wind up oftentimes becoming abusers themselves, or those who are victimized as children often find themselves continually in victimizing or being victimized in relationships throughout their lives. And so the problems aren't just here and now. These are larger problems that affect society for generations to come. So problems tend to develop in a society when the larger group of individuals within the society really become neglectful and fail to pay attention to these problems as they develop. Mahoney identified several different conditions that have to exist before an issue or situation is considered a social problem. This includes things like a condition or situation that is seen publicly as a social problem because of a public outcry. There has to be some attention applied to this particular issue, and people have to be upset about it. Enough people have to be upset about it to bring it to the attention of the larger society. And the condition must be at odds with the values of the larger society. Let's look at poverty, for instance, with this. Now, poverty exists all around us, and the efforts of our society to resolve poverty have been unsuccessful. And now, there are people who are poor today, and I am saying this in very relative terms, but people who are poor today may be better off now than they were, say, in the 1940s when they were poor. But they are not well off at all, and they are still suffering very greatly. In any event, in a society where it is believed that we all have equal access to resources and that we all have equal opportunity and those kinds of things, poverty really is at odds with the value of our society, which would suggest that really everyone should be able to be successful. Another issue, another condition rather, is that most people must be in agreement that a problem exists, because if you can't get a a majority of people who are willing to take a look at this, or at least a loud minority of people who are willing to bring it to the majority's attention, the problem won't be addressed. There needs to be some kind of a solution to the social problem, and sometimes when there isn't a solution, well, we ignore the problem and hope it will go away on its own or leave it for the next generation to resolve. And finally, the mass media also plays a very large role in how these problems come to our attention. Where the press pays attention to things, what they look at, and has a lot to do with the way we recognize it and what we decide to do about it. Another basic concept that Glicken wants us to look at, and I think it's something that is important for us personally, is to recognize the variety of political philosophies that exist in our culture and in our society that have something to do with the kinds of things that happen in our society and how it is that economic stratification occurs and poverty is perpetuated and inequalities continue. Now, we pretty much, when we think about politics, we think about the Democrats and the Republicans, and the Democrats are really kind of more to the liberal, to the left, as we would call it, and the Republicans are more conservative or to the right. And there really are, in modern day politics, you see some extremism, so to speak, in right now in the conservative end of things with the Tea Party and everything, which really is trying to pull the moderate conservative Republicans, to further to the right, and and insisting upon taxes being lowered and less services being provided to needy individuals and those kinds of things. And a lot of people that stand to the left of our president, who, mind you, the conservatives think is quote-unquote socialist. There's a large group of individuals in America that are very much to the left, politically speaking, of our president, who are very unhappy with the fact that he hasn't been more strident and forceful in carrying out some changes in society, for instance, alleviating poverty and unemployment and those kinds of things. And so we tend to think of this as the spectrum of political philosophies. Really, this is a very narrow spectrum, and whether we have a Republican or Democratic president, whether the Congress is controlled by Republicans or Democrats, yeah, it makes a bit of a difference, in the short run in terms of what bills get passed and, those kinds of things. But really, nothing changes in the long run because both Republicans and Democrats, both are quote-unquote liberals, and conservatives are very much tied to our economic system, the capitalist economic system. And both of those, left and right in American political thought, support that system. And with that, you can pretty much figure there isn't going to be a lot of change. And I'll tell you now, and you'll hear me say this again, poverty will never be eliminated with the capitalist system being our primary economic system in America. Poverty is created by capitalism and will always be here if we don't take a look at some major restructuring of our economic system. But that's perhaps for another course, certainly not for today's lecture. There are Glicken identifies 4 other major political philosophies that impact the way we approach problems in the United States. I think there's probably more than this, but just for the sake of this discussion, libertarianism, and we hear about libertarian candidates for president occasionally, and essentially a libertarian view believes in the maximum personal liberty and the smallest government possible. The least government intervention, the more freedom, the more personal liberty we should have. Libertarianism, for instance, suggests that we have really no business in any of these wars anywhere around the world, and that we should be just concentrating on creating an environment where we can have our personal liberties and be free. Socialism is, now again, think about this. This is really talking about a political philosophy here. The big government looks after the rights and needs of citizens. But when you think of socialism, I tend to think of socialism as the opposite of capitalism, and it's in the economic sense. When we hear socialism, we think of Russia and China and the dark kinds of clouds over us, and controlled by the state and working in factories and things like that. I can remember from my high school, our political science class was called Problems of Democracy, and I can remember from the high school Problems of Democracy class when they would talk about socialism, there'd be slides with a dark gray background and people in gray clothes carrying, lots of heavy things and just moving, trudging forward, and in the background there's flames and the hammer and sickle from the Soviet Union up in the upper right. I mean, this is the kind of the picture of socialism that Americans are raised with, and socialism is an economic and political philosophy. It isn't like that, and so one thing that would be helpful is perhaps to kind of get our knee-jerk reaction to socialism out of our system as much as possible and try to view it as another way of thinking about things. And quite frankly, there's some very good things in that particular model. Communitarianism is a political philosophy you don't hear a lot of. I think some of our great early leaders, like Thomas Jefferson, for instance, I think were probably commutarians, I suppose. And this focuses upon belonging to a community and honoring the traditions and identity, the ethnic identity and national identity, those kinds of things. So you might call it nationalism as well if it's on a larger level, but it also, communitarianism also focuses upon what your role is in your local community and the need to contribute to that community. There's some real roots in the Puritan movement, when the Puritans landed, and their whole focus was upon, some of the good that defined a human being was what they could do in the community. That was more important, how they could contribute to the community. And as you can imagine, when the nation was first being settled in this, wilderness in the 1600s, contributing to community was extremely important. It was a matter of survival, in fact. One other philosophy, radicalism, where it is believed that individuals have to progressively protect their self-interests or lose their strength to those in control. And I would add, not only protect their self-interest, but also aggressively advocate for change. That's a radical philosophy. There was a whole school of thought within the social work profession when I was being trained in the 1960s, referred to as radical social work. And it really was about system change. It wasn't so radical, but it certainly was a lot more radical than what we wound up being trained in, which was primarily ego psychology and individual change and providing therapy services. A lot of social work schools provide a much more activist kind of a training that teaches us how to intervene in the community in a legislative level to change the systems that oppress our clients, rather than focusing upon teaching us how to help clients adjust to an oppressive system. So, something for you to think about, and I'm going to ask you to think about things all through the semester, because it's important you know who you are when you come into this field. What you're about. Ponder, what is your political philosophy? Are you conservative? Are you liberal? Do you have some activists? Do you have some extremism in your thinking? Can you see yourself as a libertarianism, if it weren't such a cuss word in American language? Would you consider socialism as your primary means of thinking, your primary political thought? So these are things that are worth thinking for yourself, because how you answer this question, where you stand on these issues, really impacts your perceptions of problems and of our clients and the systems that they exist in. So these things are going to shade your perspective on your work and affect how you view other people. This is very important because, remember, we're not here to impose our values and beliefs on our clients. We're here to help our clients within their own system, in their own world, respecting and honoring their own values and beliefs, even if it's at odds with our own. So politics, political philosophy, like I say here, if you want to avoid this at parties and in casual conversations, what do they say? Never talk about politics and religion. We're going to talk about that stuff here, and we really do need to talk about this stuff throughout the semester. Social work really is the only helping profession that deals with the internal aspects of the human condition, values, beliefs, emotions, etc., and the external aspects of the human condition, that is the systems and the society and the community and the families in which we exist. This is one of the things that kind of marks us as unique. Like we have psychology, we have sociology, as philosophical or educational backgrounds to our practice. Really, we integrate both. Social work looks at systems and systems in which the client exists. So while you're helping an individual perhaps in your job, and that's what probably most of you are going to wind up doing, is working with individuals, because that's how our profession is structured these days. At least for now, that's how it's structured. You don't just work with that individual in isolation. So if it's a child you're working with, and you'll probably wind up working with kids at one point or another if you go into social work, you also work with their parents. You'll work with their siblings. You get to know their teachers some, and you interact some with the other kinds of the legal system, perhaps, or the court system, or the medical community, whatever it is that is impacting your client, adult or child. You look at the relationships between that individual and those important people around them, and less focus upon changing that individual and more upon impacting the relationships, so that the individuals and the systems that person exists within can function successfully and enable that person to get along well in the world. So really, we look at both the external and the internal, and it is referred to as person and environment, PIE. You'll see it referred to lately, and that sort of is one way of kind of looking at it. Other people, other professionals have referred to it as the ecological model of social work, that you look at the environment, not just the person. So yes, you may wind up providing therapy for your clients. Yes, you may wind up providing case management services for your clients, and you may be focusing on getting that person from one activity to another and things like this. You're doing a lot of individual work, but remember, one of the biggest roles you have on behalf of your clients is your role as an advocate. And your goal is really to empower your client to be able to exist in this world without you or other helping agents. Just like many of us function, well, we all need help, and none of us function independently and individually. Certainly, I don't believe that anyone stands on their own 2 feet in this world anymore. But we want to empower our clients to be able to function as independent of others helping them as possible, and you do that by advocating for them with the systems, as well as by helping them directly. So we want our clients to be self-sufficient. Glicken identifies 6 different core social work values that are very, very important, and there's a lot of different kinds of values, political and religious, that are tied up into these core values. But people that are in this profession should be able to embrace these values. And the first is service. Your primary goal is to help people in need and to address social problems. You are of service to other people. Social justice. When we see injustice, when we see inequities and inequalities, when we find discrimination, when we see people oppressing others, our responsibility is to challenge that injustice and to try to change that. It's one thing with an individual to challenge that. It's another thing when we see the institutions and the systems within which we work creating social injustice, and we will see that. You will see that. And it's important to remember that we're here to advocate for our clients and to ensure social justice. The dignity and worth of the person. We respect the inherent dignity and worth of every client we meet. And you may say to yourself, well, of course, we do that. Everybody. I respect the dignity and worth of everyone. But think about the homeless person that you encounter sleeping on the sidewalk as you walk past while you're shopping downtown, or think about the sex offender who just got done molesting a child down the block from you and who's going to go to prison, and you find out he's molested other children in the past and is likely to molest again. Do you see these individuals having the same dignity and the same worth as you? And if we don't, these are the things we need to address and come to understand what has happened with those individuals that brings them there, and work to really begin to understand and recognize their own worth as human beings. And that's not an easy thing to do. we recognize the importance of human relationships. It's a central importance, and that's why the person and environment model is the one that social workers and the profession adopts today. This notion of working on the relationships between the individual and those important persons and systems with which they interact. Social workers have integrity. We must work in a trustworthy manner. We need to keep our commitments to clients and to others, whether it's our employers or other professionals in the community as well as our clients. Because if we don't follow through with what we say we're going to do, what do our clients have to pin any hopes on, and why should they put their faith in us? And finally, competence. Social workers should practice within their areas of competence and always work to develop and enhance their professional expertise through continuing education. Workers also need to recognize when they're not competent and to step out of work in those areas where they don't have the competence they need to address certain problems, but make referrals for others. The U.S. Department of Labor says that social worker is a profession for those with a strong desire to help improve people's lives. They help people function the best they can in an environment, deal with their relationships, and solve personal and family problems. See, again, the interesting thing here is that this really is kind of focused on the individual, and it says we change people to get along in the environment, and it's very important to keep in mind that sometimes we have to work on changing the environment. It is that systemic kind of thing we have to keep an eye on. So finally, and this is actually the last slide. It's kind of an odd ending for the lecture, but this is what I have. So, social systems include people, organizations, the larger society, and they all interact together. And so this is kind of how we organize our work, by seeing the individual interacting with all those systems. And there really are three core systems: the micro, the mezzo, and the macro. I mentioned micro and macro at the beginning. The mezzo is a third system that really, I think, involves probably I would think perhaps individuals somewhere between the big administration and the big institutions of our society and the legislature and Congress and the lawmaking bodies and everything. But the mezzo systems include perhaps the schools and the hospitals, the medical community. For instance, an interesting mezzo issue I think that we struggle with on a day-to-day basis is the proliferation of prescription drugs. We have doctors in our communities that very willingly write prescriptions for just about anything, and to individuals who really have addiction problems, and it's very difficult to deal with that because the doctors can justify it being doctors, and it's hard to convince anyone that they shouldn't be taking medication if a doctor has prescribed it. Now, we're not in a position to tell people what medications they should or shouldn't take, but we are in a position to see when people are abusing medications and when the medical profession is facilitating that. And so that's something that a social worker might address. I think it's a mezzo issue and might address that in the community. Get involved in some organizations to try to change those things. So that's a good example of a mezzo system issue. And so micro would be more the individual, family, and the primary relationships in the individual's life. So again, think in terms of person and environment, whether it's a sort of an individual at the center and concentric rings, going from the individual to family to community to society or to government to society, however that is. You can kind of see there are many different levels of intervention, all of which we should be interested in as social workers. So that's the first chapter in your text, and hopefully give you some things to be thinking about between now and the next learning unit, which will open next Sunday night. So in the meantime, I hope you have a good week, and thanks for listening to me. Talk to you later.